Right, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to you all. My name is Gloria. I'm part of the GetCoin events team, and I'm here with Joe. And Joe is from the Algorand Foundation, and they'll be going over setting up your developer environment in Mac and in Windows. Before we get started, I just wanted to take care of a little bit of housekeeping. The session's being recorded, so if you need to come back and watch that, that's totally fine. You can find this session on the GetCoin media page on YouTube. And so we'll go ahead and put it under the Greenhouse Hacks playlist. So I'll have this session and all the other sessions that were recorded there. Second of all is if you have questions, feel free to drop it in the chat or in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring both. And then if you're watching on YouTube, you can drop it in the chat there as well. And last but not least, in the chat, feel free to say hi. Let us know where you're watching from and what you're working on. It lets us find out a little bit more about yourself, but it's also a good way for y'all to find out about each other. With that, I'll hand it over to Joe, and Joe, you can go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Gloria. So, as Gloria mentioned, I'm Joe from the Algorand Foundation, and today we're going to be going through the development environment setup. So, basically, going through all the tools that you need in order to effectively develop on Algorand. The original plan was to go through the steps step by step on both Mac and Windows, but we ran into some technical difficulties basically getting a Windows virtual machine up and running. So, instead, I'm going to be walking through step by step on Mac. And then as I'm installing things on Mac, I'll be talking about what the installation process is like on Windows. For the most part, it's the same software. It's just the steps you have to take in order to install it is a little bit different. But I'll try to talk through it best I can. And if anyone has any questions, of course, afterwards you can reach out to me or go on the Discord and get support that way. So first, to get started on Mac, the one thing we're going to be using to install most of the software is this tool called Homebrew. If you're already a developer using Mac, you probably have Homebrew installed. And if you're on Windows, we're not going to be using any software for installing other software. You're just going to have to go directly to the websites, which I'll point out, and install through the installer there. But for Mac, we're going to be using Homebrew. If you go to brew.sh, you can see the installation command here. You just run this command and it will set everything up for you. So once you go through this installation step, you should have this command called brew. If I open up my terminal here, I type brew, I can see that I do indeed have it installed. So once you have brew installed, we're ready to start installing some of the packages that we'll need. So the first thing we're going to need is Docker. So Docker, for those that don't know, it's basically a way to start a containerized set of applications. So it's basically a way to run software on your computer without having to manually go through the installation steps. And it's a way to kind of separate the applications from the rest of your computer. It also makes it really easy for installing software because it installs in a known environment every time, and it's the exact same on every single system. So you don't have to worry about like dependency issues and stuff like that. So for Mac, installing Docker is as simple as running this command here. So you can see I'm on brew.sh. I'm looking at the Docker cask. The important thing to note here for Mac users is that when you're installing with brew, you want to make sure you have this -- cask flag there. And that will ensure you install not only Docker itself, but Docker desktop. All right, so we're going to copy this command here, go over to the terminal, paste it in to run the installation process. So that's going to take a little bit to install. So while it's doing that, and as you can see, I want to mention if you're on Intel or M1, it'll automatically know which version to download. As you can see here, I'm on M1, so it's downloading the ARM version. If you're on Intel, it'll download the x86. So while that's installing, I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like on Windows. So on Docker for Windows, before you actually install Docker, you need to install something called WSL. And WSL is basically a way for Linux to run on Windows because underneath the hood, Docker, and this is true on Mac and Windows, leverages Linux in a virtual machine. So the WSL on Windows is basically a way to easily run Linux and what is essentially a virtual machine, and then Docker Desktop will leverage that virtual machine for running Docker. So on Windows, you need to explicitly install WSL. It's pretty straightforward. You're going to need to restart your computer a couple times in between these steps. But basically, you run this WSL dash dash install, and that'll take care of pretty much everything that it needs for the installation. And then I think by default, it will install Ubuntu distribution. If you want to use something else, you can. But I recommend, especially for using Docker and for Algorand development, you stick with Ubuntu. And then once you have that installed, you can then go ahead and install Docker Desktop. And I do want to mention that if you don't want to install WSL, Docker on Windows can also leverage Hyper-V, which is like the Windows VM management platform. But for most people, if you don't already have one or the other set up, definitely recommend going with WSL. So on Windows, once you have WSL installed, you go over to the Windows install page for Docker and you download Docker Desktop for Windows and install it through there. It's a fairly straightforward process. But again, on Windows, you might need to restart a couple times. But once you have Docker Desktop installed, from there, the usage of Docker is pretty much the same on both Mac and Windows. Also, should mention that if your primary operating system is Linux, I'm not going to be talking about that too much because it can vary so much between distributions. And if you're running Linux as a daily driver, I assume you know how to install packages. So install Docker and all the packages that I'll be talking about today. So that's the installation step for Windows. Just downloading this exe, running it, installing it like any other program. And then I'm going to go over here, check on my Docker install for Mac. As you can see here, what Brew did is it basically downloaded the DMG and then ran all the necessary functions it needed to actually install Docker. So to ensure Docker is actually set up right, go ahead and run the Docker app. And again, on Windows, it's the same thing. You're going to have a Docker application that you can run. And it will take a second to start up here. So you're just going to wait Docker Desktop starting. During this process, you might also see this pop up or something similar on Windows. Just make sure you click OK and you enter in your password. And this will, and this will get everything started. So when you first install Docker, this is what you'll see. Excuse me. It might ask you if you want to run through tutorial. You can do that if you want, but in general, to ensure that Docker is actually working, you can just copy this command, go over to your terminal, and on Windows, I recommend doing this through, I believe you do it through the WSL terminal. You might also be able to do it through a PowerShell, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Either way, you want to go to a terminal where you have Docker installed. You might need to figure out which one that is. And you're going to run this command. And if you get output there, then you know Docker is working. Another command to run is Docker PS. This is basically like the equivalent of top or htop, basically just making sure um, what, basically checking what containers are running, what commands they're running, what ports they're using, stuff like that. So now running these commands, we can see that we do indeed have Docker installed and it is functioning. So the next thing we're going to do is install the Algorand specific tool called Sandbox. So Sandbox builds on Docker. So if I go over here, github.com/algorand/sandbox, and Sandbox is basically a Docker setup that will set up a node and indexer that you can use for developing. For those that aren't familiar, when you're developing an Algorand, pretty much anything you do, so like sending transactions, compiling stuff, you need to interact with a node, or in this case, the specific software is called AlgoD. And AlgoD has HTTP endpoints that you need to interact with in order to do things like compiling, sending transactions, reading state. And then there's also a software called Indexer, which basically takes the state of the blockchain and puts it in a Postgres database, makes it easy to query. which also has HTTP endpoints. So when you're developing, we generally recommend that you set up a node that you can quickly interact with, and you don't have to worry about connecting to mainnet or testnet. You can set up your own private network. So in order to install Sandbox, all you really have to do is clone the repo. So all I have to do is if I do git clone Sandbox, cd Sandbox, and then in this Sandbox directory, there will be a Sandbox script. So this is a bash script. So in order to run it, you need to be in a bash shell or just run bash sandbox. In my case, I'll just be running /sandbox, and then you use the command up to signify that you want to bring up the network. I'm going to use the -v flag here to enable verbose output, so that way we can see what's going on behind the scenes as the environment's getting set up. And then I'm going to type dev here to specify that we want the development configuration. I believe by default, this is the default. So if you didn't have -dev, it's still set up with the dev configuration. But here I want to explicitly define that we're using the dev environment here. So I run sandbox up -v dev, and this is going to go ahead and start pulling in all the things it needs to run those containers, which again are basically just like isolated applications running in a isolated operating system. So as you can see here, it's going through and installing all these things that it needs in order to run these applications. On Windows, the process is fairly similar. So what you need to do is open a WSL terminal, clone the repo, and then run the sandbox up-v dev. And the process should be the exact same on Windows as it is on Mac once you have all the software installed. Also worth mentioning that on Windows, you might need to manually install Git as well. I think it comes by default with WSL, so you might not need to. But if you don't have it installed already, definitely make sure you have Git so you can clone the repo. And as this is installing, I'm going to let this do its thing. It's going to take a while, especially the first time you install it. After you install it once, it'll have a lot of this stuff cached, so it'll be a lot quicker for bringing up and down networks. But as you can tell, the first time it's installing, it has to run through the install script, set up the participation keys, and all this stuff can take a while. So uh, while that's installing, what I'm going to do is head on over to the next thing we want to install, which is going to be Python. So again, on Mac, you're going to be using Brew to install it. And on Mac, you might actually already have Python installed. So if you run Python 3 -- version, you can see here is that I have Python 3.10 installed. If you have a version lower than 3.10, you're going to want to install 3.10 or higher. And the reason being is that the latest versions of our development software for Python, so PyTeal and Beaker, which I'll talk a bit more in depth about a bit later, but those require versions 3.10 or higher for the latest versions. If you're on a Python version lower than 3.10, you're not going to get the latest releases, and you're going to be missing out on important features. So make sure you have 3.10 installed. So on Mac, if you don't already have it installed, you just do brew install, brew install Python. And for me, I already have it installed, so I'll just complain about it already being installed. If this doesn't install 3.10, you won't just want to specify at 3.10 or higher. But I believe at the time it should default to 3.10. So that's the installation step for Python on Mac. And again, to check that you have it installed, just run Python 3.3 version or Python 3 version to make sure you got 3.10 installed. On Windows, to install it, you just go to this Python download page, so python.org/download/Windows, and download the latest release, which as you can see here is 3.10, and then run through the installation steps like any other software in Windows, and then you should be good to go. And again, on Windows, you just want to run and make sure that you have Python version 3.10 installed. Because again, if you're on a lower version, it'll still install the necessary software you need for development, but it won't be the latest version. So you want to make sure you have the latest version. Okay, so let's go back and check our Docker. And it looks like we do have SendNet or Sandbox fully up and running. So when you set up Sandbox, it'll print out a bunch of information uh, about Sandbox itself. So you can see the algo version, index version, Postgres, goal node, the health, the available accounts, all sorts of stuff. The one thing you want to do here is make sure that you can actually interact with the Sandbox. So here we already see an example command. So we're just going to copy this same command, run it again. And as you can see here, this is verifying that we indeed uh, can connect to the node, and we can see all the accounts that we have installed on the node. By default, there's 3 accounts with the algo distributed like so. So we have 2 main accounts with most of the algo, and then 1 account with a little bit less. But once we see this, you know that you have Docker and Sandbox installed, and then from there you have your own, basically your own private network that you can send transactions to. You can use for debugging, so on and so forth. In this specific video, we're not going to be going too in depth on how Sandbox works and how you can start interacting with it. We just wanted to go over the installation process for setting up the node. And I see someone asking if we're going to get a recording. Yes, there will be a recording, and in the description on YouTube, we'll have all these links. So don't worry, you'll be able to go back and walk through these steps after this session, and I'll also be sure to be available on Discord. And if you have any questions there, we'll be able to answer them. And I also see someone is saying that they're having a problem with the Algorand node and indexer. Service failed to start. So that you probably want to go on Discord and post it in the Sandbox channel. That sounds like it might be a problem with Docker specifically. I think I remember some people having to completely log out and log back in order for it to work, or even restart your computer. So I would try that, and if that doesn't work, head over to the Sandbox channel on Discord, and someone, or maybe even myself, should be able to help you out there. Uh, so now that we have Docker installed and Python installed, we can do one last thing, which is install Node. So we have a couple different SDKs available, but the most popular one you're probably going to be using is the JavaScript SDK, because a lot of people write their dApps as a web application. So you're going to be using Node. So on Mac, again, we're going to be using Brew. You just copy this command, brew install node, run this command, and it'll go through and install node just like we previously installed Python and Docker. So while that's running, to install node on Windows, you can head over to this download page on Node.js and download the LTS version. You can also download the current if you want. It shouldn't make too much of a difference when working with Algorand. Kind of, if you know you want the current, download the current. Otherwise, LTS is probably what you want to run. Download the installer, and again, install it like any other software in Windows. Then once it's finished downloading, you should be good to go. Okay, so now that we can see over here on Mac that we have Node installed. So if we run node --version, we'll use the command, we can see that we have the latest version here. So I guess Brew by default installs the latest rather than LTS. Again, it shouldn't make that much of a difference. So whichever one you prefer is fine. Okay, so now that we have Node, Python, Docker, and the Sandbox set up, we're ready to start installing some of the libraries that we'll be using for actual development. So at this point, with Node, Docker, Sandbox, and Python, you have your environment set up, and now it's just a matter of installing the actual software itself. So whether you're developing on, Python or JavaScript, your packages might be a little bit different. So I'm just going to talk about some of the main packages that you'll probably be using. So the first of which is PyTeal. And for those that don't know, PyTeal is a Python library for writing smart contracts, Algorand smart contracts in Python. So as you can see here, as I mentioned, the recommended version or the required version is 3.10 or higher for Python. So again, I would want to reiterate, make sure you have 3.10 or higher installed. Then to actually install it, and this is agnostic for Windows or Mac, and everything going forward here should be agnostic for Windows or Mac. So you can follow along on either system. Do pip install PyTeal, or in this case, I need to do pip3, and I need to make sure I can spell, and it will install PyTeal. Now, I already have PyTeal installed, so it's not going to go ahead and do it. And then the same exact process for Windows. It'll take a while to install, but once you have PyTeal installed, you can then start using it in your pack in your smart contract development. Now, in a lot of cases, you're going to be using VM, so you need to install it separately in the virtual environment. But that's the installation steps for PyTeal. It's just distributed through pip like every other Python package, so pretty straightforward. And then once you have PyTeal installed, another tool you might want to install is Beaker. So Beaker is a framework that basically builds upon PyTeal. So when you're using Beaker, you're using it to make writing a smart contract and interacting with that smart contract easier. Should be mentioned that Beaker is still like pretty experimental and in the pretty early stages, but it's a very useful tool. And I think in general, if you are interested in learning about Algorand development, definitely play around with Beaker. And if you run into problems, definitely make an issue or something. But Beaker makes it really frictionless to get started. So I recommend at least playing around with it. And I see someone in the chat saying that they ran into an issue with getting the executing their smart contract for testing. In this session, I'm going to just be going over the software, so I'm not going to be going through how to exactly use it. So I won't be going over testing in this session. But if you reach out to me offline, I'll be happy to help you. And then in future sessions, we'll also be going over a bit how to use this software and how to do stuff like testing. So for Beaker itself, and one of the things, reasons why you might want to use Beaker is it makes testing a lot easier. Which again, I'm not going to go too in depth on in this video. In this session, after the towards the end, I'll go through a example repository that uses all these tools that you can run and play around with. That uses Beaker, the PyTeal, the PySDK, the JavaScript SDK. Basically, everything we've done in this session, you can use that demo repo to see if it's all working. But for now, if you want to install Beaker, it's installed just like any other package. I believe it's PyTeal-Beaker. Let me make sure, or Beaker-PyTeal. And I already have it installed, so it's not going to reinstall it. But this is the command you run to install it. And from there, you can then pull in both PyTeal and Beaker in your applications, just like any other Python module. So that's the smart contract development side on Python. And then one other thing, when you get to testing smart contracts, specifically testing with Python, you're going to want to make sure you have the PyAlgorand SDK installed. And again, just like all the other Python packages, it's distributed on pip. So you can run this command. I already have it installed, so it's not going to reinstall it. But this will install the SDK. The SDK is the software that directly interacts with the node for deploying transactions, um, compiling code, debugging, stuff like that. So in terms of Python, these are the main packages you're going to want: the PyTeal, Beaker, and PyAlgorand SDK. Now for the JavaScript front end side, for Node, you're going to want the JS Algorand SDK. So this is going to be the main thing you're going to be using for interacting with the blockchain, similar to the Python SDK. This is what you're using for like interacting with the blockchain, reading state, sending transactions, debugging, stuff like that. So for Node itself, what you do is, let's say you have example project. do npm init, run through here, then npm I believe it is just, yep, Algo SDK. And that will install the Algorand SDK. And then in your script, you'll be able to require it or import Algo SDK, just like any other Node module. And one thing also worth mentioning, if you're playing around with Beaker and you're interested in basically making it easy to interact with a Beaker contract in your JavaScript code base, there's this tool, which is again also experimental. As you can see here, the warning, zero tests, please report issues. This is all fairly experimental, anything to do with Beaker, and is subject to change. But I think it's important to mention it because it's really cool software and it makes the development experience a lot better, at least in my usage of it so far. But again, it's experimental, stuff might change. So when you install Beaker and Beaker TS, just make sure you're aware of that, and things might change in updates and so on and so forth. But Beaker TS, again, you would just npm install Beaker TS, distributed through npm, and everything will get installed that way. So the last two SDKs I just installed are the JS SDK, and this is the SDK for Node development or for JavaScript development. So if you're running a front end, in this case, I just created a folder called example and I installed it. So if I do a head of the package.json, you'll see that the Algo SDK is installed here. And this is what you need to install per project that is interacting with Algorand if you're writing in JavaScript. And again, the SDK itself is for interacting with the blockchain. So sending transactions, reading state, stuff like that. And then this Beaker TS SDK or package is for basically converting a Beaker Smart contract into a JavaScript interface. So that's all the software and all the SDKs that you'll probably, or not all of the SDKs. As I mentioned, we also have other SDKs for other languages. So the official ones are Go and Java. Then we also have community SDKs for languages like Dart. We have a Unity SDK, C Sharp. So if you're going to be using those less common languages, we do have SDKs for them, but I'm not going to be walking through them here. I'm just going through Python and JavaScript because those are the most uh, common languages you're going to be using during Algorand development. And so once you have that all set up, if you want to test everything, make sure it's working, what you can do is head over to this Beaker auction repository. So github.com/algoranddevrel/Beaker auction. And what we can do, let me open this up in code. I will clone here to my home directory, open it up in VS Code. To mention, if you don't have VS Code installed, the Visual Studio Code installed already, I highly recommend installing it. It works on both Mac, Windows, and Linux, and it's generally the reopen. Certainly the preferred IDE for Algorand. And on VS Code, you can also install extensions. So some extensions you might want is the Algorand VS Code extension. This offers like syntax highlighting for Teal, which is really helpful. Maybe some Docker extensions, and there's Python extensions, there's TypeScript extensions. Basically whatever language you're working in, there's probably an extension for it in VS Code. So definitely recommend checking out VS Code. And what's nice is you also have integrated terminals as well. So here in the repo, you might notice a couple of things. So first, the README is basically going to walk you through the steps to install the Python dependencies first. So here we'll just go Python. Sure, we're using Python 3. We're going to install a virtual environment. and then we're going to activate our virtual environment, and then we can install our requirements. And what this will do is install the PyTeal and Beaker packages, and the PyTeal, Beaker, the PyAlgorand SDK, and then also PyTest, which is what we use for testing in this repository. So once we have that set up, what we can also do is run to our web directory, run npm I to install our install our node dependencies, and then from there we can execute the test. That will be our first thing to do. So we already have our VM and dependencies installed. So now we can just run the pytest command, and this uses Sandbox. So if I go over here, this auction is a contract written in Beaker, and VS Code is complaining about the VM not being configured correctly. I'll just ignore that for now. But this is a contract that is an auction contract. So there's bidding, you start the auction, you can create the auction, so on and so forth. And then, again, I'm not going to talk about too much what each specific thing is doing here. The main point going over this now is so you have something to play around with after you get the dev environment set up. So this auction.py is the actual contract itself. And then this test auction.py is what's executed when we run PyTest. So here, running PyTest, you are basically testing to make sure that you have Beaker set up, make sure that the Algo SDK is working, and then making sure that the Sandbox. So if we look at the code here, we're actually deploying to Sandbox. So it's making sure that it's interacting with Sandbox correctly, which again is that Docker setup of the private network. So if you can run this PyTest command here after setting everything up, you know that you have your Sandbox set up, you have your Python environment set up, you have all the SDK set up, and you're good on the Python Sandbox side. Now, the one other thing that you want to do is cd over to our web, and you can run npm run beaker. And let me talk about quickly what this does. So as you can see here, this beaker folder directory is empty. But if I run npm run beaker, it'll generate a TypeScript, basically like a TypeScript a class that we can use to interact with our smart contract. And that is ultimately what's used over here in our source code. But again, I'm not going to be walking through this code and exactly how it works. I know I'm going through this pretty quick. I'm just going through this so you can make sure that you have everything set up right. Then if you run npm run serve, that'll launch up this application. And then you can go through here, set up your wallet, and make sure that everything is working. But if you can load up this screen and you don't see any errors here, then you know you have everything installed. And at this point, that pretty much concludes the topics we're going to be going over today. So again, the development environment involves setting up Docker, and on Windows that also includes WSO, and then setting up the Sandbox, which is a private network that you can use for development and testing, and then setting up Python and Node, and setting up all of the um, SDKs and libraries that you need for smart contract and DApp development. So at this point, that concludes what we're going to go over today. And if you have any more questions, especially if you're on Windows, felt a little left behind since I didn't go through the step-by-step on Windows, definitely join the Algorand Discord. So if I already talked about this in our last session. If you haven't seen the resources session, definitely go back and watch that. It's recorded on YouTube, where I point out some of the useful resources. But one of them is the Algorand Discord. Then over here, if you have specific questions, our dev tools section is especially relevant for today. You can go to Sandbox, JavaScript SDK, Python SDK, whatever you're having trouble with, go to that channel ask for help, and I'm sure someone, perhaps myself, maybe someone else from the Algorand Anchor Foundation, or just a community member, will be able to help you. But at this point, once you got this web app running, you have the test running, your environment is set up, and you're ready to start Python or start Algorand development. So be sure to tune in for future sessions where we'll be going over this software more in depth, talking about smart contracts on Algorand, how they work, and how you can get started developing using these tools. But until then, if you have any questions, feel free to refer to the recorded session or reach out to me directly.
Yeah, thank you again, Joe, for walking us through this. This is super helpful. Again, if you have questions, reach out via Discord. Until then, I know there's 2 more sessions. Tomorrow's session is going to be in Spanish, and then Saturday's session is going to be in Hindi. But there are people who are going to be here available to help you if you do have questions. So just feel free to give it a try and reach out via Discord to all the different developers at the Algorand Foundation that will be helping you through it. All right, everyone. Well, I hope you have a great day today, and I will see you during our next session. All right, bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.